technology and all the video and the Zoom fatigue that people were feeling, we tried using our sermon podcast feed in a different way. Rather than putting up our sermons, we put up podcast interviews with authors that I know and love and admire, and we called it Pastor Jack's Backpack. Just put a little quirky, fun title on it. So we did about 3 or 4 of them, and we thought it was appropriate to start out our new series of this author interview by interviewing one of our very own, the Rev Clare Robert. Woo, woo, woo! And it's an unusual thing for us because previously I would meet with the author either online or just by ourselves in person and record that and then go back and edit it. Tonight you are getting our very first live author interview with an audience present. Yeah, so give yourselves a round of applause. So Claire, no take-backs, no undos. This is going out into the world right now. So it's being broadcast on our Facebook page, our YouTube page, and then later I'll download the audio and upload it to our podcast feed, which you can find Spring Glen Church on Apple or any of the sort of podcasting apps, I believe we're on for the most part, or just on our website as well. And not only is this a celebration of Claire's book, but also it is the way we've decided to celebrate that Claire has been a minister here for 10 years. Can you believe it? And I will say I am so grateful. I'll give her official bio in a minute, but I just want to offer a note of gratitude that when you come in as a young 30-something minister to be the senior pastor to an associate pastor, in the later parts of your career with as much experience and knowledge as you have, with the gray hair, with the beautiful hair, that relationship can go a lot of different ways, and it can. I have a lot of friends and colleagues where that relationship became one of animosity. And it has been so meaningful to me, the way that we have this mutual respect and love and joy at working together. When we first started, Claire often described that sense of on-ramping, like getting on the Merritt Parkway. You're driving and, Claire was already on the Merritt and I was getting on those very short on-ramps, and you never know if you need to slow down to let the person go in front of you or speed up or change lanes. And we just maneuvered that awkwardness very well and developed such a good working relationship. Claire was often my sounding board throughout most of my time here. And we would just sit and have these long chats about everything and anything, and
On-ramping you. The blessing and the pleasure has been all mine.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. But so here we are. Let's adjust your mic to make sure you're getting picked up. Maybe if you put it a little bit higher on your. Oh, you're muted down here. That's what it is. Yeah. No, move it up. I'd say take the clip-on part and move it up higher.
How's that?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
The blessing and the pleasure has been all mine. I got to say it 3 times.
Yeah. So, a little bit of a bio on the Reverend Clare Robert. Born in Brooklyn, raised in Long Island, a real New York gal, claims that, or tells her story in such a way that she first felt a call to ministry in 1973 as a member of the Catholic Church. Now you may be thinking, Catholic Church, how would that work? And that was a time when there was this movement to push for women's ordination, and there seemed to be this real possibility that it would happen in the Catholic Church, and as we have seen, it did not happen in the Catholic Church. But that didn't stop you, because when God calls you, nothing can stop you, amen? So Clare went on to get an MDiv, Master of Divinity, which is the degree that most ministers get to train to be ministers, in 1978 at the Interfaith Metropolitan Theological Education, which was later given sort of a certification through Lancaster Theological Seminary. Interfaith Metropolitan Theological Education was an experimental seminary at that point, right? Nobody was really doing interfaith ministry in that way, or education in that way, which is so cool. She then used those degrees to work in theology and public policy in D.C. She taught ecumenical theology in Geneva. She did more graduate work studying in Lyon, France. I apologize if I'm saying that wrong. And as well at the University of Geneva, returning to the U.S. to work in educational consulting and corporate consulting, specifically on ethics and character development, which I think is fascinating. And then, in returning to the U.S., joined Orange Congregational Church, which is another United Church of Christ congregation. And that is where she started to reclaim her call to ministry, which brought her to get a master's in sacred theology in 2001 from Yale Divinity School, and saw her get ordained in 2003, where she subsequently served at Naugatuck UCC and Guilford UCC, before now serving at Spring Glen Church in kind of 3 different jobs, right? You were hired as an associate minister to one degree, and then that position shifted a little bit, and you were associate minister again, but with some slightly different focus and hours. And then now we in lots of collaboration and conversation between us, created this sort of experimental position of chaplain, where you get to focus on the pastoral care side of ministry, and jealous am I, you get to let go of the administrative pieces of ministry. And here you have been, 10 years on, and in that time, you had a sabbatical, in which, did you start this book on the sabbatical, or just finish the first draft on the sabbatical?
Well, let's say I've been writing it for 10 years.
You've been writing it for 10 years,
Right,
okay,
yeah.
great.
So the sabbatical was a time where I was able to do some more concentrated work, but then, there are hundreds of rewrites.
Yeah.
So, it's never done. But
It's still not done.
Yeah, still not done.
Yeah.
I'll probably change it after our conversation.
Yeah.
But, the sabbatical was a big help, and but there are a lot of initial drafts that go back even to the late 1990s.
So here we have this product from your 2018 sabbatical, which you entitled, "You Will Be Happy Again." I love the cover art here. Also, if you look inside, for those of you who have it, the sort of children's art as well inside, which I think is just beautiful. It's a very clever packaging and very representative, I feel like, of the story in here. This book you have written is a way for you to process your experience of loss in losing your son, Nathaniel. So talk to us a little bit about why you felt called to write this memoir.
Well, I had to process this loss, which was a very significant one. Nathaniel was diagnosed in 1992, and he died in 2008. So that was 16 plus years of taking care of him, and many, many ups and downs during that experience. And it came completely out of the blue on a March afternoon, his diagnosis, and it just hit us with this incredible force that life was not going to be what we thought it was going to be. Chapter 1 of this, not so much chapter 1 in the book, but the original diagnosis then turned into curative. Everything's going to be okay. You can go home. We solved the problem. And a year later, that turned out not to be true. So I had to completely rework what I thought life was going to be. And I had to do it theologically because, as you described, I had a lot of theological training, but the fact is that it absolutely did not prepare me for this experience. And so I had to rework everything, just starting from the beginning. And I may have studied feminist theology. I knew a lot about Roman Catholic theology. I knew about the differences, Protestant and Catholic, and I could talk about the sacraments. I knew nothing about suffering. And that was really a shock to me. Like, how could I get this far in the game, so to speak, and not know anything?
Right.
And that's why I felt that I had to write, because I had no other way to process.
Yeah.
And I had to take what I had learned and start looking in the Bible for other things that I hadn't learned.
So curveball. I sent you some questions ahead of time, but I'm gonna throw you a curveball question that I'm not sure. Yeah.
Right?
Jack Davidson, true Pastor Jack style. Guess what, Claire? We're doing something different today. When I first, so this is both about your book and the 10 years of ministry here. When I first came on board, I felt this sense of hesitation or reluctance to dig into it, or sort of mine your personal life for theological public reflection. Right? There were a couple sermons early on in my tenure here where you were almost like asking me for permission to tell your story, or double checking with me that people would be able to receive it. Talk to me about that development from not feeling ready to share it to this place where you've written an entire book about it.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting, really the question is you could write something, but why publish it, right? And why get to that point? Well, I guess that part of the answer is that after being here for this amount of time, I knew that I was not pushing my story on people as my story. Nathaniel is always with me when I'm wherever I am, right? And if I'm in my office and talking to people about their lives, I have some sense of loss. Not your particular loss, but my loss, and it can meet you, but I didn't want to directly bring him into the conversation, unless it was directly pertinent, which has not really been the case. So it really had to do with, I think, pastoral discretion. I don't want to impose my story on people when they have their own heartache. And so that was really where I was coming from most of the time. And then, as I've been thinking about this, obviously, like what changed? I think maybe two things changed. One is that I had received so many stories from you with so much love that it was possible to be more open. I mean, this open. And I think that actually that just hit me this morning when you were preaching about the touching the wound.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And, there's this kind of phrase in ministry, preach from the parts that are healed and not from the wound.
Right, from our scars, not wounds.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that there's been a lot of healing in my life. And that healing has come through being here as your minister. And so it's okay to talk about it now. Whereas in the past, I don't think it was. For me.
It was too raw.
It was too raw.
Which is interesting because in some ways it happened so long ago, and yet I imagine even now with the healing, it still feels like it's very present and very concurrent in a sense.
Yes, the feelings are a little more attenuated. It's not like, I could just say honestly, when I drove to my job in Guilford, I cried every day on the way there.
Wow.
I didn't necessarily talk about it when I got to the office, right? That hasn't been the case here. I mean, I think time has helped. There's no question. This has helped. Just writing has helped. Psychotherapy has helped. Friends have helped. The love of this church has helped. People have helped me. My family has helped me. So much, you know. I mean, healing is just not one moment. Healing is just a long-term process. I think of metabolizing what you experience. And I know that I have had a tremendous amount of healing through my ministry, meaning that you have given me so much that it's possible for me now to like exchange my story with yours, if I could use those words.
Which, you know, I think you and I have talked a lot about some of the like toxic theologies that come with loss and the way people respond to the loss of others, not necessarily their own losses, right? Which I see in some ways this book addressing. For example, you talk about, correct me if I'm getting the exact phrasing right, but suffering Olympics.
Oh, yes.
Right? Which is a very different concept than what you were just talking about, that sort of shared storytelling, that shared experience. There's vulnerability in what you're describing. So talk to us about those kind of differences between your experience of some of the toxic theology around loss and grief versus the sort of the things that brought healing.
Well, that's interesting. That phrase, the suffering Olympics, came out of actually conversation with some friends that I've known my whole life when we had not seen each other for many years. And, you know, old friends get together and they tell each other what's been going on. And somebody said to me, well, you know, you've won the suffering Olympics.
You're like,
actually,
thanks.
let me correct that. She said, you have suffered more than us. And my interpretation was, oh, I must have won the suffering Olympics. I mean, a kind of bitter, you know, just angry response to that. So I don't, she didn't say it, I said it in my own mind, and then I wrote about it later. So
you were bringing, your response was anger,
that's
not her.
right. Yes, it wasn't,
she thought she was saying something compassionate,
right.
But you received that with rage.
Right, because what happens, I think, when you have something which is so untoward and out of sequence, that people don't know how to respond. And you don't know how to respond to them, because everybody is processing their own thing. If you are a parent and you hear that a child can come home at 2 o'clock and at 9 o'clock be diagnosed with a brain tumor, you don't want to know, right? You're protecting yourself. You have to. Because as a parent, I didn't want to know when bad things happened to other people's children, because that meant it could happen to me. And then one day it happened to me. And that was a really scary thing, I think, for other people. And people did not pull away, but you could see that they didn't know what to say. And that's just hard. And then there's a part of just comparison. We were probably the only family in our town. There's a whole story in the book about being the only one and how difficult that was. And in the end, I realized that that was not true, but there was a long time when I believed it. And that I had a special kind of suffering that other people didn't have. So comparison is always a little bit in play in these. I didn't really answer your question about toxic theology, but one of the things that I've realized is that there is a general, let's say, out there idea that when you go through a hard thing, that somehow, on some level, it's your fault, right?
Huh.
Now, you don't go around saying it's my fault. You say, what did I do wrong? Why is this happening to me?
Right.
And I think that that is just a natural response that we have because we've grown up in a, what I used to say, a cause and effect universe, right? If you do something, something will happen. You do something, you study hard, you'll get a good grade. You touch a hot stove, you'll get burned. And then things come along that don't fit into that at all. What do you do with them? And in the Bible, there's a lot of you sinned, right? Why is the man born blind?
Well, yeah, they ascribed a theology of he must be a sinner or his parents must have been sinners. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And then
And
Jesus
Jesus says, no.
Right, no, that's not the case. But then they add on, this is for the glory of God. And I used to say, Nathaniel's brain tumor is no glory of God,
Ooh.
right? So you know, there's always a reworking of understanding, but that idea that we should be able to figure out a cause, and if we can figure out a cause, then we can figure out a solution. And when you're in a situation where there isn't a solution, what do you do? And that, I think, that's the human condition, right? There are a lot of places where there isn't a solution, and yet you have to endure in some way, and you need to go on. But the idea that God is testing you,
Yeah.
or it must be my fault on some level. I mean, look at the book of Job,
Yeah.
right? All the friends come in, and they've got all the reasons that these things are happening to Job,
Yeah.
and none of them are true. And in the end, you know, Job is the one who recognizes his own. I mean, my interpretation is he sees the bigger picture without really understanding, and he says, wow, this is really bigger than me. And maybe I can't understand at this point. But what's fascinating about the book of Job is that at the end, everything works out okay, right? The last chapter gets some children back, and everything is okay, and his flocks are growing, and it's almost like the author can't take the idea that it just ends in ambiguity. So is that...
Well, even in that, like, it all ends okay, it's like erasing the family that he lost to say it's all okay. Like, he still went through a great amount of loss, even if there is some restitution and new life, right?
And one child does not replace another.
Right.
Right? But
Say that again.
One child does not replace another.
Yeah.
But there's something in the fact that the book ends that way, where you want to believe that somehow it's going to be okay.
Okay. Well, and that's, in terms of toxic theologies, I think a lot of it comes down to what you were saying before about, like, people just don't know what to say. And so we go to these easy phrases of comfort, right? Like, the God has a plan.
Right. Everything happens for a reason.
Everything happens, yeah. Which feels like, okay, nice, maybe that's, like, it feels like it's trying to communicate hope. And yet, like you said, this brain tumor was not for the glory of God, right? Like the idea that God requires suffering in order for God's plan to work just feels, I mean, that's not a God I want to praise,
Right, and for me, the turning point around what is a workable theology in this that I can live with, right? Because that's not the God that I want to praise or relate to or feel that's on my side. There were really like two moments. One was reading When Bad Things Happen to Good People, with this idea. This, of course, is written by a rabbi whose son had progeria, which is the illness where you age very rapidly, and he died at about age 12. So Rabbi Kushner wrote a book in response to, I'm in this circumstance. Where is the God that I expected to help me through? And he was able to say, the universe is imperfect, and we just have to live with that ambiguity. That was a big help for me. And then William Sloane Coffin, the Protestant minister, UCC minister, whose son died, I don't know the year, he preached a sermon after, so this was a sudden death. And people were telling him, everything happens for a reason, right? God needed another angel in heaven, and he said, that's drivel. And he got up at Riverside Church and said, God was crying when my son Alex went over the bridge in Boston. And that really spoke to me, that there was a God that suffered with me and suffered with my family and suffered with my son and was sad that we were going through. I mean, sad, it's hard to say God being sad, but that there was the cross is Jesus suffering with us. And
Which,
there it is.
right, different than Jesus suffering for us,
That's right. Yeah.
but suffering with us. Interesting.
Can I tell you this one quick story?
Yeah.
There's a moment, it's not really in the book, but there's a moment of betrayal in this whole story with Nathaniel, which I will not go into in detail. But when I found out that we had essentially not received full information about his initial condition, I received the information and I was just frantic with rage and how could this be that we didn't know everything, we weren't told everything. And my initial thought was, this is betrayal. Jesus was betrayed. And I just thought, there's something in that story of betrayal that's very human. That people you trust don't show up for you in the way that you thought. And somehow knowing, you talked about mapping ourselves
into the story,
into
yeah.
the story.
Yeah, which disciple are we?
I immediately mapped myself into that story, and I thought, I'm not alone in this. Jesus knew
You
what
mapped
this
yourself
was.
as the betrayer or the betrayed?
The betrayed.
Interesting.
And it was okay. Okay, no, it wasn't okay, but it was some way of coping with what had occurred.
Well, even on the less extreme of not being betrayed, but like everybody falling asleep, right? In that great, like they didn't know, right? They just didn't know. So, talking about story, I find this so interesting because initially when you started writing it, I was expecting, you're such a deep thinker. So I was expecting theological reflection, but this is very heavy narrative. Heavy is the wrong word, because it's very digestible. Like each vignette, and I think vignette's the right word. You give these very poignant. I get chills reading some of the chapters where you were talking earlier about that, 2 o'clock he came home, I told him to get a snack. By 9 o'clock that night, everything changed, right? Like that, there's sort of hair-raising, but very approachable accounts of what you went through. And yet, without that sort of heady academic talk, there's very deep theology at work in how you describe your experience. So talk to me about that decision to go memoir versus academic theological reflection.
Well, I wrote a really nice paper for Yale, and I'm sure that it's sitting in the library and nobody's touched it for 20 years. So I thought, if I'm going to write something, it has to be something that people can relate to.
Yeah.
Without the theological jargon and all the, whatever separates that kind of language from the way people are usually talking. And then I was very lucky, and that's also, you'll see it in the first chapter, to meet Larry Bloom, who's here today, actually. And he is a writer and a memoirist and a teacher of writers. And when I met him, he said narrative is everything, and helped me tell the story and helped me enter into it in a storytelling mode and weave in the theology. Because that's the way that this could be something for other people and not just my rant of how unhappy I was, or a theological treatise that would really not touch anyone or connect with anyone, or few people, let's put it that way.
So in that vein, rather than just talking about the book, would you be all right reading? I'm posing this surprise, would you read a section for us? We talked about this ahead of time.
I thought I was going to read it early. I thought you had forgotten.
Yeah, I did actually. We were going to have her do this at the beginning, and I forgot. would you go ahead and read that section?
Sure.
And
So I'm going to read from a chapter which is called Manna, and it takes place in 93, right? This is early in the story. But this is when Nathaniel has had his second surgery. First surgery, 92, second surgery in 93.
Would you give page number so folks who have the book?
Yes, if you have a
can-
book, I'm on page 45 at the bottom. And just to give a little bit of context, the second surgery was very, very difficult. They had to go very deep into his brain, and he was really not very responsive at this point. And we're in the hospital for a couple of weeks. Patrick is coming back and forth from Orange, and we are, struggling to spell each other, taking care of Nathaniel. So the days dripped by. When Patrick did not come to the hospital, I spent most of my time sitting by Nathaniel's bedside watching him sleep. When Patrick was there, I took a shower or a nap. Nothing made the pain go away, and the dread of what was to come bore down on my chest, hollowing out any other feeling. I could not pray. What was the point? My prayers had been spurned. Hadn't I done my part? My expectations about life, what I was due, what I might hope for were gone, and I had nothing to replace them. But one afternoon, and I can't say when, since one of the first effects of a long hospital stay is to lose track of normal time, sitting there, watching the in-breath and the out-breath of my son, a word popped into my head: manna. I remembered the story from the book of Exodus. The manna arrived when the Israelites were lost in the wilderness, starving, complaining. They wanted to go back to Egypt, where there were fish, cucumbers and onions, leeks and garlic, because wandering in the desert was hard, harder than they had anticipated. Then God sent a strange food, a type of bread that rained from the sky or formed like dew on the ground. At first they didn't want to eat it, but after a while they were hungry enough to try, so they ate. They called it manna. This food had a unique property. It would last for one day. Every day it would appear, but they couldn't keep it until the next morning. They learned to get by on what was given that day, even if it wasn't what they had wanted or expected. It turned out to be enough for them to sustain themselves as they traveled. I could only remember the basic outline of the story, but it was enough to comfort me. We were the children of Israel here in this hospital room, a wilderness called brain tumor land beyond the known world of middle-class life and assumed privilege. No one we knew from our regular life was able to go with us. We could cry and complain, and we did, and we could rail against the God we felt had put us there for no reason we could understand. And who could help us? Even the experts, the doctors, saw no clear path. There were very few guideposts for how to live in the world of illness. We had to learn a whole new language of low-grade tumor, residual disease, drugs with names like carboplatinum and vincristine. We became instant experts on treatment options and too familiar with the horror stories of the unlucky ones like us who found themselves in this desert of parental pain. We didn't know if Nathaniel's brain would heal enough for him to read Dr. Seuss again or Frog and Toad. Would he ever again score a winning goal in soccer or throw fast enough to pitch in Little League? He had been slated to join the gifted program at his elementary school. Now we wondered if he would even be able to keep up with his class. And any question we posed was answered simply with, "We don't know." But he was alive. That day, the fragment of the biblical story became my manna, providing me with a tiny taste of hope that on just this one day, we would be able to survive. I couldn't hoard the manna until tomorrow. I had to take what was given right then and there. And since the future was unknown, I had to live in the present.
Just taking that in. The pieces that stand out to me of, there's no guidepost, there's no framework for this. We had to learn this whole new way of being, all this new language. And then also the grief is so present of losing the Nathaniel that could have been, even before you lose Nathaniel. The one that was an excellent reader and an academic star and a
Great athlete.
great athlete. I think sometimes we think that grief is only really, somebody has died. But even just a diagnosis at the beginning of the journey creates grief and loss. And then that also that other piece about prayer. I could not pray. I hear that from people going through it. Part of me wonders if that's because prayer, we have a very particular idea of our relationship with God and God's role in suffering. That if we're praying, we should be praying for God to intervene.
To fix it.
To fix it. And I wonder if we changed our understanding of prayer, if we're in relationship with God, right? Relationships aren't economical, aren't transactional, right? It's not, God, if I'm a better person, you'll fix this, right? There's another toxic theology for you. You're suffering because you didn't have enough faith, but instead, it's prayer is just authentic expression of how you're feeling in this moment. There's the Anne Lamott help thanks wow, but I would also add to it lamentation, just being raging at God.
Well, in a sense, yeah, it's kind of interesting, I don't know, let's say intellectual question, but in a way, coming to know that Manna's story was my prayer. Right? I mean, I'm sitting there, I'm enraged at the whole situation, I'm brokenhearted, my family is, nobody knows what to do, it's really tough, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes this memory of this story, and that was my prayer that day. And so, I think that when we think of prayer as transactional, I wasn't praying for, I had given up at that moment on praying for a different result. Now, when you read the book, you'll see that there are chapters upon chapters where I'm trying every possible thing that will work. Any kind of faith healing that comes along, I'm all in for that. And you'll see sides of Pastor Clare that you will be a little surprised about on that.
Yeah. You went down all possible paths.
All possible paths.
Yeah,
okay?
it's fascinating.
But in that, and I think just in general, that in some ways, people are inclined to different kinds of prayer, and mine has always been a little more intellectually oriented, and so that, I remembered a Bible verse in the middle of this hellish scene that really carried me, and then became, the basis of a lot of my contemplative practice, I think, was born at that moment, when I realized this is it, right? This is it.
Yeah.
This is the moment. And
prayer not as seeking a different reality, but prayer as centering yourself on the current reality.
Right. Again, soon afterwards, that, it doesn't hold, right? You have a one-day insight. You're in a crisis. You're not going to carry that with you at every moment. But it held me at that moment. And it was very pivotal, and this Manna story has been very important in my life. And I have preached here on it a couple of times, and it comes out of this particular experience with it, even if I was never mentioning that story.
Right, in the way it holds such meaning. So in that theme we touched on a minute ago about authentic expression, I want to give people a little insight into the editing process. So Claire sent me many iterations of this book, and there was one piece in particular she wanted to run by me, and that's if you go to page 6 and 7. So about 3/4 of the way down, she talks about that night it seemed that an unbidden invitation had arrived, an invitation to attend a meeting of the club, one you would never willingly join willingly, right? So you're talking about this club of of people who have experienced such traumatic loss,
Right.
especially loss of children. Like it's a club you never want to join.
Right.
So then the last sentence here currently reads, impossible, I'm not joining your club, and I reject your stupid invitation. There's a word that's missing.
Right.
And Claire checked with me multiple times about whether or not if using profanity would get in the way of the story. And so in here, in this last sentence, used to be the F-bomb.
Right.
So you're learning a whole lot about Pastor Claire tonight. Not only was she into crystals and spiritual healing and contemplative practice, she also, I know, shock, horror,
Right.
swears.
Right.
I find that a lot of times when I encounter people and they swear in front of me, they're like immediately are like, "Oh yeah, you're a pastor. I'm sorry, I shouldn't swear." I'm like, you should hear how I talk at home. And anyway, that's all to say. It was interesting to have this back and forth with you and this question around the expectations of the language we use and how people expect us to talk about these things, and that question of authenticity versus crafting the story in such a way that people can receive it. So I don't know if I have a particular question except to just like open up an invitation to reflect on that.
Yeah.
And the choice that you ended up self-censoring.
Yeah, I went that route because it was getting in the way for me. Perhaps even more than would get in the way for other people. Maybe in my imagination I thought it would be a problem for other people and then they would reject the story. I think if I might in the next version put it back in and see what happens. But I also think that that's a word that's really overused. You know, a lot of times you turn on certain cable TV and you hear it over and over and over again, and it's like, it becomes almost banal. It doesn't have meaning anymore. And so I thought, no.
Like using too much seasoning,
right,
too much spice.
Right, exactly. So I thought, it doesn't change that much in terms of the story. And it just seemed to not be the right word at that moment. And then, there is the other aspect. I could ask you to raise your hands, but I won't. Who has never used that word, right? So we all could relate to it. That's another way of, I could put it back in. And if somebody said to me, "Oh, Pastor Clare, why are you, using that kind of language?" Say, look, that's the reality too. So it was really like a judgment call.
Yeah.
More than it was a commitment to one or to the other.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think, one of the interesting things about reflecting publicly, or just being a minister in general, is that tension and balance between being authentic versus not. I mean, it's the same thing we were talking about with your hesitation to tell your own story in the early days of your ministry, of am I getting in the way?
Right.
Versus when does inserting myself help and give people permission to be vulnerable and authentic themselves?
I think it's a judgment call.
Yeah.
I think it is. And I don't think that there's no rule. I think people would like to know what the rules are, but to me, in terms of the long term, why didn't I tell this story at the beginning? It seemed that we needed enough time for people to know me as I was as their minister before they heard about my story. And that I feel now that there's enough trust and understanding about who I am that I'm not going to impose this story on you. But
Right.
if it connects with you and it helps you, well, that's part of the reason that I published it. So, the hope for that.
Yeah.
And,
That you are part of the club.
yeah, and yes, I am part of the club, and also that everyone edits something.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, we're
And maybe I need to edit more.
Well, I think it's just there is something about just knowing that when you look at this story, if you were watching a video of it, it would, from the beginning to the end, you couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear to watch it either now, right? The whole point of the art of doing it, if in fact I've succeeded in that, is to give you enough of the story that you know what happened without taking you through every excruciating
Detail.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Right.
the art of writing.
The difference between writing your own journal versus writing for other people to enter the story. So speaking of other people entering the story, since this is our first time with a live audience at one of these interviews, we're going to open it up for questions for folks who want to dig deeper into understanding Claire's story. And to give you some time to sort of think through if you have any questions, I'll ask one more of Claire and then see if there's anybody who wants to. I'll put a mic up front and you can step up to the mic. So as you all are processing your questions, Claire, the one element that I didn't realize we shared in terms of, I knew we had this shared interest in contemplative prayer and the intersections of Christianity and Buddhism, but the camp piece I didn't know it for a couple years until you talked about some fundraiser with the Hole in the Wall gang. Can you talk some more about that? Because that comes up in here a couple times, the way camp was a place of support for Nathaniel and for you.
Yeah, the Hole in the Wall gang camp is really, Jimmy Canton is here. Jimmy is the CEO of the Hole in the Wall gang camp. So now I get to cry.
Yeah.
Wow. Camp has been so important to our family, and to know that there is a place where people are going through the same things. It was incredibly important to Nathaniel. It was the one place on earth that he knew that he was totally accepted for who he was and the way he appeared in the world. And we were, from 1994 to really now, we've just been very devoted to camp. And I met Paul Newman and got to ride in a golf cart with him. That's in the book. And and then when Nathaniel was dying, Jimmy arranged for us to go back to camp on an afternoon in the summer, and just to be there in this sacred space that was his place. And we were in this beautiful dining hall, and there was music. They made a lovely lunch for us, and we were dancing. And then we went up to what's that place, Jimmy? When you're climbing up, the tree house, right? Yeah, and just all the places that he had loved. And that was one of the most tender moments of really his last months on earth. Camp was everything. And yeah, I don't know what else I can say about it except to say that it was just, in the middle of all of these experiences, there were experiences like that, right? There were terrible moments, and then there was camp. There was the school that we discovered for him that ended up being the perfect environment for him. We were helped by an organization called Making Headway Foundation that helped families like ours. There were these breadcrumbs of grace all the way through. And
Manna.
Breadcrumbs
of grace. All comes around.
Yeah. And we were able to get through because of that. And, we were extremely lucky. Now I understand so much the privilege of that when I see, these Ukrainian families who have children who are cancer patients who can't get treatment and are in the middle of a war. I just realize, I sit in front of the TV and I say, how did these people even manage one foot in front of the other? There were blessings all the way through, and they were incredible. And my whole vocation came out of this experience.
Yeah.
But I will never say that God sent me this problem so that I would become a minister or that I would be a better minister.
Right.
That would be going back to that cause and effect, which I really don't believe.
Oh, interesting.
But I just want to say that I'm grateful that I was able to have an experience that was so healing that I hope is healing for others. And that part I will say.
I mean, we've talked about this plenty of times, and I don't know if I've ever reflected on that commonality of the roots of our call to ministry being in the loss of loved ones. And, because certainly the loss of my mother when I was little is a huge part of why I'm where I am now. In that sense of that sort of line or that nuance of, it wasn't, it's not that the suffering was there so that we were part of God's plan, but instead that there was this avenue of grace because we've been through it, like we talked today about the wounds of Jesus, even after the resurrection, that there's something about the depths of new life and hope and possibility with the wounds and scars you carry. The wounded healer, right? That's the whole
Right. The wounded
framework.
healer, right.
In that, again, on theme, being careful that our wounds don't become the primary, that we're not, gushing out all over everybody,
Right.
but still being vulnerable and open.
Right. Well, we didn't have a choice either.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I think there's this tendency to think that it, that's, I don't know how to put it, but somehow good will always come out of a difficult situation. I don't think that's always true. It doesn't always come.
Right.
But there is the capacity, if you have enough help, support, love, care,
Right.
everything, that, yes, I mean, some...
Which again is where camp comes in,
Right.
or your friends, or your DC community, or
Right.
there's, study after study in psychology shows, community connections help create resilience. They can't, some people think, summer camp is just where you send your kids to have fun, but there's something powerful about the intentional community that is created in those spaces. Along those lines of having those support systems, I apologize because I'm sure you don't want me to name you, but Patrick came up in your reading, and you obviously have such a loving and supportive partner in your husband who was with you in this experience, and I think we could have a whole other podcast about the ways in which the loss of a child impact relationship and how couples approach the experience so differently and experience the loss so differently, and yet the ways you can be there for each other.
Well, he's the only one who knows what it's like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So even, when there are times when you can't see eye to eye or our styles are very different, Patrick was always there. And the dedication at the end is we went through this together, we're going forward together. And I think that is, that's the respect that I have for him, that he took on all the economic side, almost all, to keep it going so that I could do what I did for Nathaniel, and just worked like crazy and made that possible for our other son too, to have an excellent education and all of that. There aren't any what I would say is that his loyalty is so profound. And there was one moment when things were difficult in terms of taking care of Nathaniel. I think we were at Gaylord, or maybe it was at the end of the story, where there were people who were coming to help us. And he didn't want people to come in. He said, "He is my son, I will take care of him." And that was, I think this says everything.
Yeah.
And he would shower him, and he would say, il est propre comme un sou neuf. He's as clean as a penny when he would get out of the shower. And that, that was what Patrick did. So, you know, I talked, he did all the work.
It's an appropriate representation of why you work so well together as a team. With that, I'm going to bring out the microphone, and if there's anybody out there who wants to sort of probe any deeper questions of Claire, or just sort of share, yeah, just come on up. Come on up.
Reading this book was so powerful, but all the way through I kept thinking of your other son
Mm-hmm.
and how it's so hard for the sibling, the healthy sibling. How has he talked to you about has he read the book, and did he have new perspective as an adult now?
Well, in respecting the discretion of my family, I would just say that his life was significantly impacted. He's a psychologist. He's married to a psychologist. I think that says it all.
Well, and I'll say that that's a very apt question that you ask, because there's all sorts of dynamics about these kind of traumas and tragedies, and the response of siblings going through it with and the, you know, you talked about the ways it changed Nathaniel's life, how much in any situation it changed, even, you know, scaling it down from the major tragedy to just a sort of ongoing struggle impacts the lives of the rest of the family, is a lot. Yeah.
Hey, Stephen.
Thank you for your remarks. And I appreciated when you said that your way of understanding God was that God was crying with you. And it made me think, and I haven't read the book yet, so I apologize if you covered it, but you'll be aware that in the Hebrew Bible, in Leviticus, there is a passage where Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, are destroyed, they're killed for very mysterious reasons. So the high priest's two sons are destroyed or killed. And there is a line after that simply says, Aaron was silent. Aaron was silent. That's all it says. And you have to, as a reader, fill in, what does that mean? And it's as if, I mean, for me as a reader, it's as if the entire people of Israel are silent with Aaron, and almost God also is silent with Aaron. Even God could not prevent this horror. And so that reminded me of what you said, that God is crying with you. And it's in that silence that is the healing. We have to fill that silence, I think, and as Aaron somehow did. But it doesn't tell us in Torah how he did that. It leaves us to come up with that ourselves. Anyway, just a comment. So.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's it. It leaves it up to us, right? It
Or
leaves
even
it
just
up to us.
making room for that silence. I think some of our toxic responses come from a need to fill the awkward silence, right?
If I can find it, I'm just going to
Yeah, you go.
read the end of a chapter. Let me see if I can find it. Which, this is a dinner that I had in the hospital with an Orthodox Jewish family. And it was a Shabbat dinner, and I was invited. And we were sitting there talking about all of these questions. And so this is the very last paragraph. We've had a lovely dinner. We're toasting l'chaim. It's great. And we're talking about what happened to our families. This is a family also where the son has a brain tumor. As I sat on the folding chair in the parents' lounge, I noticed the contrasts: hard questions, tender celebration, the bitterness of incurable illness, and the sweetness of festive reprieve, animated conversation, and a silent God. Together, humans probing the mysteries of suffering, but finding no answers. Or maybe that was the answer.
I think this is a good point. I'll say if there's more comments or questions, we'll hang outside by the picnic tables for a little bit. We don't have like a formal reception or anything, but there's a lot of conversation to be had. But I think we're at a good point to wrap up. And so I'm going to turn it over to Claire one more time to close. And these daffodils you brought in this morning, yes. And there's an entire chapter about daffodils. If you would just close us out with either a summary or a reading about the meaning of daffodils for you.
I'll just read a little piece of it, but before we close, I just want to say how very grateful I am for all of you who are here, for all of you who have accompanied me through different parts of this story, for everyone that I have the honor of ministering to at Spring Glen Church, for everybody who's listening online, my beloved people far and away, and to you, Jack, for thinking about this and pulling it together this way and making it so interactive and just really an extraordinary experience for me. The story of daffodils is that we planted daffodils the week that Nathaniel was dying when he was in hospice. And somebody helped me, a woman who's a daffodil expert, and I didn't even know where she had planted anything. And then the fall comes. He died on October 30th, and you're in the spring. And Patrick and I were going out, and we were looking, and we saw these daffodils that came from nowhere. They weren't in any bed that we had planted, and they were way in the back where there's kind of scrub woods, and all of a sudden out of this area comes these little tete-a-tete daffodils, the face-to-face, right, eye-to-eye daffodils. And so Patrick tells me, this is the place where Nathaniel fell last summer. He had been running and couldn't stop and had tumbled right into the ravine, just at that spot where now grew bright yellow tete-a-tete daffodils. I called Hanukkah, is her name. I called her, I grilled her. Did you plant them? Did you put any extra bulbs near the woods? No, I didn't do anything. Well, we didn't know. And then I talk a little bit about signs, and I say, and here was a sign, the daffodil, growing where no one had planted it. Not Hanukkah, not me, not anyone, showing up at the edge of the woods, just at the place where he had fallen. And I have a thing you can see about daffodils. So, thank you for coming.
Well, Claire, thank you for sharing your story with us. Thank you for sharing your family with us. Thank you for ministering to us both tonight and for these last 10 years and for the entirety of your life. Because no matter what any church institution says, you've been a minister since birth. God formed you for this. God created you for this. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. You are a blessing to this world, and I'm glad that you took the time and energy to write and rewrite this story so that we could all share in that with you and not compete with you.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah.
Lots of love to you all.
Blessings. Yeah.
Blessings.